Hello, my name is Peter Makovicky. I'm a professor at the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences at the University of Minnesota. And it is my great pleasure to join you at the Natural History Museum of Utah for your polar-themed Dinosaur Fest. And I'd like to talk to you today about some of my research and my fieldwork experiences in Antarctica, and also put them in the context of our understanding of that continent and the history of exploration of that very harsh and distant place. I'm also the lead curator who helped develop the Antarctic Dinosaurs exhibit in collaboration with the with the Natural History Museum of Utah. And so a lot of the fossils that I'm going to talk about and the research that you will see in this talk are actually in that exhibit. So I strongly encourage you in the next 4 months, when it's still around, to please visit the exhibit and in person see some of the things I will be presenting today. So Antarctica in the present day is a harsh place covered by thick ice sheets, the smaller West Antarctic ice sheet and the larger East Antarctic ice sheet, which is over 2 miles thick in the polar plateau. And because of these ice sheets, life on this planet is largely restricted to coastal regions. So we're all familiar with some of the animals, such as seals and penguins, that inhabit the coastlines of Antarctica. But even though they rest and reproduce on land, these animals are essentially part of the marine ecosystem. There are almost no terrestrial ecosystems on the continent today. And until about a little over 100 years ago, scientists didn't know whether there were ever in the past any complex ecosystems such as we see on other continents. And that's of course related to the fact that Antarctica is both remote and has an extremely harsh climate. First sighted in the late 1700s and first stepped on in the late 1800s, this is one of the most remote and the most difficult places you can get to on the planet, if not the most remote and difficult. Exploration of the continent by scientists on foot didn't actually start till the very end of the 19th century, and the first fossils, therefore, weren't found till the beginning of the 20th century. And they came from the part of Antarctica that is closest to the rest of the world, namely the tip of the Antarctic Peninsula. So in 1902, a Swedish expedition set off for the Antarctic Peninsula with the aim of doing scientific research and overwintering there. And on their port call in Buenos Aires on their way down, they picked up an artist, an American named Frederick Stokes, whose goal was to actually capture the landscapes in vivid color there to bring back as a record of the expedition. Now, Stokes would sort of work along the margins of these islands that the Swedes were visiting in the James Ross Basin. And during his perambulations, he actually came across a small number of fossils which he picked up and pocketed. And unlike the rest of the Swedish scientists who overwintered, he took the supply ship home at the end of that austral summer and took his fossils with him to the University of Chicago, where they ended up as part of the Walker Museum collection that subsequently was folded into the Field Museum collections some 40-some years later. And the important aspect of these fossils, which were described in 1903, is that they look nothing like the animals we know in the marine habitats of Antarctica today. They included this lobster-like animal called Hoploperia. Stokes originally just picked up this small steinkern that represents the thoracic region, but subsequent finds have told us what the whole animal looks like. He also found ammonites, snails, and bivalves, much more typical of marine faunas at lower latitudes today, that is, from warmer waters. Direct evidence that the climate in Antarctica had been quite different in the distant past. Now, these fossils were published by an American paleontologist, while the Swedes had to overwinter not once but twice because their supply ship that was supposed to pick them up after the first winter sank. And so they were rather disappointed when they came home in 1904 to find that some of their glory of finding fossils in Antarctica had already been stolen by one of their former expedition members. And to add insult to injury, in the description of these fossils, their expeditions had been attributed to Belgium rather than to Sweden. But nevertheless, important as they were, these fossils, which you can actually see in the Antarctic Dinosaurs exhibit, sort of fell into the obscurity of history, and not much was made of them at the time. Another set of fossils perhaps had a bigger impact on our thinking, and that's of course related to the fact not only from where they came from, but also who found them. And these fossils come from the central Transantarctic Mountains. This is one of the few areas where you actually have relief, that is, topography sticking up over the ice. And the reason that these fossils were found is that this is the region that had to be traversed by early expeditions that were attempting to reach the pole. So Robert Falcon Scott, who is of course famous for his 2 expeditions to the pole, would land out here at McMurdo Sound and would have to traverse through the glaciers of these mountains up onto the polar plateau. And this is what the on-the-ground view of these areas is. Here we have, this is the Shackleton Glacier region, so not quite the same glacier, but very similar topography, where we have large exposures of Permian and even Triassic rocks, and as well as a lot of volcanics. And so in these regions, you can actually pick up fossils. And on their traverse, the Robert Falcon Scott's party, of course, cut through the Beardmore Glacier region to get up onto the plateau. They reached the pole in January, several weeks after a rival Norwegian expedition led by Roald Amundsen had arrived there. And on their return journey, the British were starving, largely because they had misplaced some of their depots, and also because, unlike the Norwegians who relied on sled dogs, they were man-hauling, that is, pulling their sleds on skis. And the caloric output that they had calculated, the per-day needs per human, were sort of an underestimate of what the actual cost of doing this would be. And so, as a result, these 5 expeditionaires ended up starving to death. But on their way, they stopped at the Beardmore Glacier to do some exploration, and they actually collected a number of fossil specimens that they deemed so important that it was the last thing that they kept on their sled. So sadly, Falcon Scott and his expedition perished merely 11 miles from a depot that would have saved their lives. And they were found the subsequent austral summer, and the last thing they had on their sled, which was put on this cairn next to the cairn that covers their tent and their bodies, was a number of rocks from the Beardmore Glacier region, including some that had fossils of a seed plant known as Glossopteris. So on the left, you can actually see the original fossil-bearing rock, very codified, that Wilson, the scientist and doctor on the expedition, had picked up in the Beardmore Glacier region. And it's very hard to see what the fossils look like, so on your right you will see a much better preserved example of a leaf mat of these Glossopteris-like leaves. So these are large arborescent or tree-like plants that are now currently completely extinct. They have no living descendants, but which are known from multiple continents around the world. And so this was a very sensational find, one that proved the presence, if you will, of fossil forests in Antarctica. But this one, too, sort of fell to obscurity, no doubt partly because in 1914 the world was consumed by World War I, and very shortly thereafter by World War II. And in the during the war years and interwar years, there was very little exploration of the Antarctic continent for obvious reasons. And so scientific exploration and discovery was rather stymied until into the 1950s, when there was a global push to actually better understand the geological history of the Antarctic continent. And in 1957, there was an international push. There was this declaration of an international geophysical era. And with the United States military, particularly the Navy, in charge, a number of stations were put in place as this massive Operation Deep Freeze took place. So the U.S. put its 3 permanent bases, which are Amundsen Scott on the pole, McMurdo down here, and Palmer Station at the tip of the peninsula, in place as part of Operation Deep Freeze, along with a number of other temporary bases such as Little America, which was on the coast out here. And various other nations from across the globe also partook in this initiative. So we have many of the bases you have, particularly the ones in the interior of the continent, are actually a result or a direct derivative of this International Geophysical Era. And key for the understanding of the geological history of Antarctica, of course, was the emplacement of McMurdo down here. McMurdo is the largest scientific base on the continent. It has a number of permanent structures that you can see here. And the reason that it's here, of course, is that this is as far south as you can sail a ship. And this is something that even Robert Falcon Scott knew. So down here in the foreground, you have Discovery Hut. Discovery Hut is actually a prefab 1900s bush home from Australia that Falcon Scott purchased on his first expedition to Antarctica and erected down here at Hut Point, which is as far as he got his ship Discovery at that time. And so, essentially, both from 1904 onward, McMurdo Station here, or the ground it's on, has actually served as the gateway to the interior of the continent. And the really neat thing, of course, is that everything is frozen in time. So you can go into Hut Point here, and there you can see a picture soon after it was erected, with the ship and Discovery in the background, the hut in the foreground. But you can go inside today and actually see the remains of supplies and hunted penguins and seals and various other items that these expeditions that worked in the area left in the early days. Essentially frozen in time, but also preserved through the actions of Heritage New Zealand that are in charge of this. But with the opening of permanent base at McMurdo and infrastructure in the 1950s, the interior of the continent suddenly became accessible through to exploration, both from aircraft and on the ground in a variety of ways. And so, of course, geologists flocked towards the central Antarctic mountains, where you actually had the rock record, the geological history of Antarctica available to you. And so in the subsequent 50 years, we have learned an incredible amount about the geological history and the fossil history of this continent. Here in this photo from 1985, you can see the remains of 2 camps. This is a 1978 camp here, snowed in, and the 1985 camp down here. And so many of our expeditions, including the fossil hunting ones, have basically targeted the same sets of outcrops because this is really delimited not only by the limited geographic area in which rock exposures are, but also the particular ages of the rocks that we want to look at. And so the first fossils were vertebrate fossils from the central transantarctic mountains were discovered in 1969, which led immediately to the subsequent expedition in 1970 that included paleontologists and was led by Ned Colbert of the American Museum of Natural History. Now, Ned at this time was a fairly close to retirement, but he brought with him James Kitching, famed South African paleontologist, who made many of the critical discoveries in the central transantarctic mountains. And here he is at Thrinaxodon Col, a site named after the multiple specimens of the synapsid cynodont, Thrinaxodon, that he discovered along this avulsion surface that he's lying on there. And this is an extremely productive area. We have actually collected Thrinaxodon specimens from just 50 yards away from where Kitching is currently, or in this photo, was digging up his specimens. And of course, everything being frozen down there, everything preserves, you can actually see some of the traces of the early campsite. So here is that 1978 hut and now the 1985 hut that you saw in that previous historical photo in their present day, or at least I should say in 2018 when we flew over in a helicopter for a recce flight. So it's important to remember as we work in the Antarctic, we are really following the footsteps of many intrepid explorers and scientists who came before us. So why are these mountains here? What is it that draws us down here? Why is there a fossil and a rock record in this particular region? And this is, of course, tied to the geological history of the Earth at the time. So the rocks in the central Antarctic mountains range from about 250 or so million years ago, right around the Permo-Triassic boundary, and up to the Middle Jurassic, so somewhere around 150 or so, or 160 million years ago. So it's a significant chunk of time, and these rocks were accumulated in what was then Pangaea, or at least the early record was collected in foreland basins in Pangaea. So if we look at this reconstruction of the continents from the Triassic period, we can see that Antarctica is down here as part of Gondwana land, that is the conjoined continents of Antarctica, South America, Africa, India, and Australia over here on the far west side of Gondwana. And the rocks that we're seeing in Antarctica were accumulated in a foreland basin because you actually had a subduction zone here along the southern edge of the Gondwanan part of Pangaea. So just as the rocks that you have outside your windows in Utah, many of those were accumulated in a foreland basin. The sort of rock record, the great dinosaur record of Utah, was collected in a foreland basin as the Laramide and severe orogenies pushed up the mountains you have around you. In a similar fashion, but in a much older time slice, you have a foreland basin capturing this rock record in Antarctica. After that, why are these rocks up in the air? Well, that's partly because you have rifting that happened much later in the Jurassic that actually pulled these continents apart. And the thinned, lighter lithosphere of these rocks allowed them to be pushed up by the underlying mantle. So that's why we have dinosaurs and other fossils at 10 to 15,000 feet in the mountains of Antarctica. Zeroing in on that rock record, as I already mentioned, it starts near the top of the Permian. So the Permian is the last era within the Paleozoic before you get into the Mesozoic. And these are the rocks that Robert Falcon Scott first sampled when he found those Glossopteris leaves. Now, to date, we have no vertebrate fossils from this particular rock unit, but there's a very, very rich flora of various plant parts, most of which belong to the Glossopteris-like seed ferns. So it's very common to find both roots, vertebraria is the organ taxon name for them, but also trunks, and also leaf mats of many representing different parts of these tree-like plants of the Permian. And they are very rich and abundant. In some places, you can actually measure the spacing between trunks in a single rock horizon or bedding plane, which tells us that we had fairly dense forests at these high latitudes at the end of the Permian about 252 million years ago. But suddenly, if we move up section through the rocks into the next, to the top of the Permian, we encounter a mass extinction. This is the largest mass extinction in the fossil record, where we think that on land, somewhere between 50 and 70% of species disappeared, and in the oceans, even more. And one of the things to disappear at this time are the Glossopteris forests. And this is a very, very sudden boundary, a very sharp boundary, if you look at the rocks on the ground in Antarctica. And then above it, we enter the Triassic, the first era within the Mesozoic. And this is a very different environment. We find no remains of plants, but we do start picking up the first vertebrates. And I'll use that as a cue to sort of shift gears a little bit to talking about fieldwork on the ground, what it's like to be in Antarctica, based on expeditionary work I did a couple of winters ago in 2017 and 18 in the Shackleton Glacier region. So together with an international team of scientists, vertebrate paleontologists from the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, University of Washington, and Roger Smith from South Africa, we prospected these early Triassic exposures that you see behind us for fossil vertebrates that were first discovered in 1970, as I showed with that picture of James Kitching. And we were based at a camp. This is our camp, the Shackleton Glacier Camp. This long smear that you see here is actually an ice or snow runway for ski-mounted aircraft that include large LC-130 military transports flown by the New York Air National Guard, but also we had helicopter and twin otter support. And from this camp, we would fly out to the exposures, such as this one, or here at Kitching Ridge, where you get a good view of the geology to look for fossils. And so, unlike the Permian, which is downslope from here, where you find the large tree trunks and leaf beds of Glossopteris, there are no plant fossils in this series. And instead what you have is these muddy overbank deposits separated by cliff-forming braided stream deposits. So a highly variable and changing environment where you have braided streams moving across the landscape because there's no vegetation to impede them, to channel them in, or to force them to form river channels, but rather these broad braided streams that interrupt sort of floodplain deposits. And it's in these floodplain deposits, the shallow sort of finer grained sediments in between the braided streams, that we find most of the fossils. And just before sort of I move on to the fossils, just give you a glimpse of what life in Antarctica is like as a scientist. So this was home for 6 weeks, one of these Arctic oven tents. And this is probably taken at nighttime. So remember, we're working in 24 hours of light during the austral summer. And the work requires helicopter support. So the camp that you saw was about at 5,000 to 6,000 feet on the Shackleton Glacier. Most of our sites are 20 to 40 miles away, accessible by helicopter and at altitudes of between 9,000 and 11,000 feet. And on the ground, what we do is very much the same set of operations that you do looking for fossils elsewhere in the world. You walk over the outcrop. Sometimes it's hard to find things. In Antarctica, it's not because of vegetation as it might be in Utah, but rather because there might be snow cover. But once you find something such as this, you start working around it. Another difference here between Antarctica and many other places where we look for fossils is that these rocks are very hard. As I already mentioned, they've been somewhat baked by these intrusions of magma that came some millions of years after the deposition. And so they require a lot of heavy equipment to remove the fossils, including rock saws and jackhammers. But the quality of the fossils can be tremendous. So what you're seeing here is the skeleton of a juvenile Lystrosaurus murrayi specimen. This is a Dicynodont, a herbivorous mammalian relative from the early Triassic, a very important taxon for a number of reasons. And if you remember 2 slides ago where I showed you the fossil emerging from the rock, this is the part of the animal that was visible, just the skull roof with this little pineal foramen, that sort of third eye that is primitively present in many vertebrates. In this case, we got the whole skeleton. As you can see, it's beautifully articulated. And we can tell it's a juvenile because the vertebrae haven't fused up. The tops and the bottoms of them come apart, as you can see here. And it's about half the size of the biggest specimens that we get from here. It's also, Lystrosaurus is probably about the largest specimens that we find in the early Triassic of Antarctica. Everything here is small. And that's, of course, because we have this Lilliput effect following a major mass extinction at the Permo-Triassic boundary. The things that tend to survive extinctions are small, and it takes them many millions of years to sort of evolve larger body sizes. Now, the most common thing we find are amphibians. There's a number, at least 3 families of temnospondyl amphibians represented in the Antarctic fossil record. Except for Cryobatrachus, most of them have not been named from this particular time horizon. And so this is where a lot of our current work is happening, trying to figure out the differences between these temnospondyl amphibian faunas. And it may be a little counterintuitive to think of amphibians as a survival taxon, because today we think of amphibians as bellwethers for environmental and climate change. There are many environmental factors threatening amphibian faunas around the world. But when you think of it, these animals have basically survived every major mass extinction since the Devonian, and at least in the Triassic, they were the most successful group right after the extinction boundary. We already talked about Lystrosaurus. Here's another beautiful Antarctic specimen, and here's a life reconstruction. So Lystrosaurus is important not just because it's the largest vertebrate in the Antarctic record, but we actually find the same species in South Africa and elsewhere in the world. And we know that they're not only abundant, but we now know from South African specimens that they had scaly skin. So remember, these things are not reptiles. They are actually on the mammalian, or the lineage that leads to mammals. They are more closely related to us than they are to any reptiles. But we're early enough in synapsid evolutionary history that hair hasn't evolved and that these guys are still scaly. Another synapsid member from or a synapsid species that we find in the Antarctic fossil record is Thrinaxodon. This is a cynodont. It's an animal that is more mammalian in its anatomy, so closer to mammals than the dicynodont Lystrosaurus. And we can see that, for example, in the fact that it has heterodont dentition. There's differentiation between the front nipping teeth and the back chewing teeth, reminiscent of what we see in mammals such as ourselves. And there's also a differentiation of the rib cage into distinct lumbar and thoracic regions, perhaps suggesting these animals had a diaphragm and breathed like modern mammals do. We don't know if they have fur, but certainly there have been interpretations of pits on their skull that suggest that they had whiskers, which are, of course, a form of hair or fur, and sort of the tactile abilities that came with that. Besides these synapsids or mammal line vertebrates, there are a number of reptiles represented in the early Triassic of Antarctica. And these include these small herbivorous procolophonids, including this beautiful specimen, which was actually the first specimen we picked up in the 2017-18 expedition. The head up here, forelimbs here, the rest of the body coming down, and this came out in 2 blocks. And besides the actual fossil specimens, one of the things that we find a lot in the Antarctic fossil records are fossil burrows. So here you actually have a natural cast of a burrow created by a Triassic vertebrate 200 and almost 50 million years ago. It's a natural cast because we have the underlying soft floodplain sediments where the burrow was excavated, And then subsequently a flooding event in one of these braided channels filled it with sand, and it hardened into rock. And the interesting thing is we find burrows of different gauges, different diameters, so probably made by different species. But they all have the same 20 to 30 degree angle from the overlying stratum. And they're very similar to burrows that we find in South Africa. The South African ones of the same age you sometimes find fossil skeletons, including Lystrosaurus, temnospondyl amphibians, etc., in the terminal chambers. Unfortunately, we don't have this such finds from Antarctica yet. But taken together, these contemporaneous burrow systems in South Africa and in Antarctica from right after the Permo-Triassic boundary, and the diversity of fossils that or species that made them suggest that burrowing may have been one of the key adaptations for animals that survived the Permo-Triassic extinction event. And sort of to underscore the importance of these Antarctic fossils, when they were first found in 1970, the first discovery of Lystrosaurus and its contemporaneous fauna, it became one of the final sort of solid pieces of evidence supporting the idea of continental drift. So the idea that the continents were actually drifting, something that we take as a given today, really only gained any scientific support in the 1950s and really didn't become commonly accepted until into the 1970s. And so the presence in Antarctica of a fauna of fossil animals that is essentially identical to ones found in southern Africa was used as one of the strongest pieces of evidence in support of the idea that these continents had been conjoined once back in the Triassic. And indeed, if we look at the distribution of fossils that I've discussed so far, including Glossopteris and Lystrosaurus, here we can see that they nicely follow these bands of rock that correspond to those foreland basin deposits in Gondwana that formed in the Triassic. Now, if we return to sort of the central transantarctic mountains and the sequence of rocks deposited there, the next fauna up is also similar to what we see in other parts of the world, and in particular South Africa. So we have a fauna of animals that include cynodonts like Cynognathus, known both in South Africa and in Antarctica. But interestingly, unlike the underlying Lystrosaurus fauna, we also start seeing some differentiation, some indications of endemism. That is, that there are some unique members of the Antarctic fauna that you don't find anywhere else. So a sort of a evolutionary differentiation of the Antarctic fauna. And among the differences, we see a new set of temnospondyl amphibians. These are large temnospondylus, alligator-sized animals that would have been predators in aquatic ecosystems, so rivers and lakes forming in these foreland basins in Antarctica. And Antarctosuchus here and Cryostega are both large species that would have reached perhaps as much as 15 feet in body length. Their skulls are crocodile-like and up to 2 feet long, so about 3 times the size of the little alligator I have here. And interestingly, while they're related to temnospondyls from other continents, we know that they are also unique. They are distinguishable, and they're not identical to what we see in South Africa and elsewhere. Interestingly, we can also tell that there are some ecological differences. So Cryostega here, which is just the tip of a snout, so basically this part of a more complete skull, has these large tusk-like teeth along the margins and on the palate as well that are up to 2 inches long, so a predator of large animals. Whereas Antarctosuchus has tiny teeth along the hundreds of tiny little needle-like teeth along the margins, which indicate it was more likely a fish-eating animal of some kind. So even though they're about the same size, they probably fed in very different ways. Outside of the aquatic ecosystem on land, we're also starting to see the evidence of larger animals. So just this year, together with Nate Smith and Chris Sedor that you saw in the team photo from a few slides ago, we published on this, which doesn't look like much. It's the back end of the skull, sort of the area where the spinal cord comes out at the back of the brain case, of a large Dicynodont. So think of a Lystrosaurus, but on steroids, a hippo-sized animal. Here it is to scale. And these animals are known from Middle Triassic deposits from around the world. They're known as Kinemaeriforms. They're found in South Africa and Argentina and Russia. And so this again represents sort of the fact that we had similar animals living on similar continents because they were connected at the time. But there are some subtle differences in the Antarctic one where we can't quite refer to one of the known species from another continent. And while we don't have enough material to confidently name a new species, we do think that it might, again, hint at this pattern of endemism or a uniqueness evolving in the Antarctic fauna, as also indicated by those temnospondyl amphibians I just talked about. So moving through time up into the late Triassic, we again lose the vertebrate fossil record, but we regain the plant fossil record. So through the last two faunas, the last two time horizons I talked about with their unique faunas, there's almost no evidence of plant fossils. But as we get up into the late, middle, and into the upper Triassic, we start regaining plants and indications that in fact forests came back. And one of these indications is that we suddenly start seeing coals again. So coal horizons form when you have an excess abundance of plant material being deposited in lakes, rivers, and streams, so much that it can't actually decay, and instead it's covered by rock and compressed. So these basically only form in very vegetated regions, usually that have high humidity and high temperatures. So they're very good indicators or proxies of the ancient climate. In this case, we can tell when the first coals come in here at near the top of the Middle Triassic on Schroeder Peak in the Central and Transantarctic Mountains, that we are actually getting back to forested environments. And it's not just coals we find, but we actually find beautiful impression fossils and carbonaceous fossils of plants themselves. So we know that we have forests coming back in the form of tree stumps, such as this, representing various types of conifer-like trees, things named Araucarioxylon for their similarity in wood structure to modern-day Araucaria and monkey puzzle trees. We also have tree ferns, things like Dicroidium, well represented here. Dicroidium has two types of leaves, as you can see here. They actually come from the same plant. And these are not the small ferns that you might see out on a walk in the woods in a disturbed area. These actually have a large trunk, like the tree ferns we see in New Zealand and parts of Australia today. Another common fossil we find is Neocalamites. This is essentially a horsetail, like the ones you might see growing on the margins of a pond today, except that these horsetails would have been 20 to 30 feet tall. So plants that we can recognize, plants that have living descendants, unlike the Glossopteris flora from the end of the Permian, which has no living relatives today. Unfortunately, we don't know what animals inhabited these environments, but as we move from the Triassic and pass through a extinction boundary into the Jurassic, we start picking up the first dinosaurs in the Antarctic fossil record. And we now have a quite remarkable fauna, all of which comes from one site, Mount Kirkpatrick in the central Transantarctic Mountains. And as often is the case in dinosaur paleontology, the reason we have these dinosaurs is pure serendipity. So in 1990, a geologist from Ohio State University named David Elliott was actually hiking up Mount Kirkpatrick towards the top, which is near 14,000 feet, in order to sample some of the basalt, some of the magmas that had erupted up there, which he wanted to compare to similar magmas known from elsewhere on the southern continents, to basically understand the rifting procedures that had pushed the continents apart. And on his way, David came across this relatively large bone, hard to miss. And as luck would have it, there was a paleontologist nearby, based in the same camp, namely Bill Hammer, who has been doing Antarctic fieldwork since 1978. And Bill abandoned the various temnospondyls and other Middle Triassic vertebrates he was digging up in the Gordon Valley to come and look at this find about 20 miles away. And it doesn't take much imagination to figure out that a 80-centimeter femur or thigh bone belongs to a dinosaur. And so Bill switched gears to excavate what essentially was the first early Mesozoic dinosaur from the central Transantarctic Mountains. This is a very rich quarry. If we actually look at the femur, what we see beneath it down here is the broken profile of the skull of this dinosaur, which became to be known Cryolophosaurus ellioti. And a number of other specimens came out of this particular quarry, both in the first excavation in 1990-91, in a subsequent expedition in 2003, and then finally the major final push to excavate all the material, which came in 2010-11, which was my first introduction to Antarctic fieldwork. So the team we went down with, besides myself here and Bill Hammer, who I just introduced you to, includes Nate Smith. This was his second expedition down. Phil Curry of the University of Alberta, his wife and paleobotanist Eva Koppelhuis, and our mountaineer Peter Braddock, who has done 40 years of fieldwork in Antarctica, and whose lives, our lives were entrusted to in terms of safety in the field. And so this work happened in the Beardmore Glacier region, the actual glacier that Robert Falcon Scott and his party followed. We were based on the Walcott Neve. A neve is where snow and ice accumulates to form glaciers at the Central Transantarctic Mountain Camp. And basically the same infrastructure as would have been in place at the Shackleton Glacier Camp, with larger Jamesway tents for our kitchen galley and other science and practical operations, and then a smaller tent city of North Face and Scott tents that was sort of our residential neighborhood, with a beautiful Mount McKellar of Permian to Triassic rocks as a wonderful backdrop. And Mount Kirkpatrick itself is much higher. It is the highest peak in the central Transantarctics. The top is around 14,500 feet. And the Cryolophosaurus fossil site comes from these buff rocks of the Lower Hansen Formation and the at around 12,500 feet. So it is the highest latitude and highest altitude dinosaur quarry in the world. And all the dinosaurs actually come from a very small area. So to date, over the three seasons from 1990 to 2010, we have collected 6 skeletons. Most of the material is from the main Cryolophosaurus quarry over here. But we also collected 2 other dinosaur specimens that we'll return to in a minute nearby. And finally, in 2003, a third taxon of sauropodomorph was collected just off the side of the view here. So this football field-sized area that you see here has contains the entire early Jurassic dinosaur record of Antarctica. And we have visited other peaks nearby with the same rock exposures, but they have, as of yet, not yielded vertebrate specimens. The rock, as I already mentioned, for the Triassic, and this is true in the Jurassic, is extremely hard. So you end up having to quarry, literally, with power tools, rocks. We can't use plaster and water to create jackets at these temperatures. So in a sense, the hardness of the rock is a silver lining. We can actually break things quite cleanly and transport them, either inside the helicopter or, as you see here, in a cargo net underneath. And altogether in 2010-11, we moved about 20 tons of rock, or rather I should say 20,000 pounds of rock, so 10 tons of rock, and about 5,000 pounds of that ended up being transported back to the United States for preparation and study. And the dinosaurs we have from here include, of course, Cryolophosaurus, which I already mentioned. On the left is the actual skull fossil, and it's named for this beautiful crest of bone on top of the skull. So Cryolophosaurus means frozen crested lizard. And it's a carnivorous dinosaur, would have weighed around 1,000 pounds and been 25 to 26 feet long, roughly. And it marks one of the first large dinosaurian predators in the Jurassic. So after the Triassic-Jurassic extinction, you have a disappearance of many of the crocodile-line predators, and their ecological niche is very quickly occupied by predatory dinosaurs such as this one. We have a fairly complete knowledge of this animal, so you can see the skeleton that's mounted in the exhibit. And based on 2 specimens now, we have almost entire coverage of both the back end of the skull, the entire presacral vertebral column, so the vertebrae and ribs from in front of the hips, the hip region and hind legs, except for the feet, and a good section of the tail. The only parts we're really missing representation of are the hands and the feet. So this is actually a very remarkably well-known dinosaur. And if you get a chance to visit the exhibit, you can actually see some of the original bones alongside our mounted skeleton. And we now think that Cryolophosaurus is a member of a small group of early diverging theropod dinosaurs. So we know that theropod dinosaurs gave rise to birds like Archaeopteryx here. But Cryolophosaurus is an animal that split off from the line leading to birds very early, probably at the end of the Triassic or at the latest in the very early Jurassic. And it represents a group that is diagnosed by having these funny crests on their head. And they're known not just from Antarctica, but the relatives of Cryolophosaurus include Dilophosaurus, which you're probably much more familiar with from the American Southwest, Dracovenator from South Africa, and of course Sinosaurus from China, also characterized by 2 crests on its head. So they're basically 2 different bones on the top of the skull that are responsible for making this variety of different crests on the skulls of these related dinosaurs from the early Jurassic. And we know a lot about the biology of Cryolophosaurus. We have, for example, done bone histology on the specimens, so we can count growth rings and see how old they are. We think our more complete specimen, the one that you see the skeletal reconstruction of in the exhibit, would have been probably around 15 years of age and probably still growing, not quite fully grown. So they might have pushed up to 30 feet in length. And we also have some idea of the brain anatomy of this animal through CT scanning. So using a very powerful CT scanner at Ford Motor Company that allowed us to cut through the very dense rock of the Hansen Formation matrix, we can reconstruct the brain, and we can see a number of features that are interesting. So the brain is highly angled. The forebrain is over here. The sense of smell would be here, the sense of sight here, the optic lobes, and then we have the hindbrain here. So there's a long, big, sharp angle between the front and hindbrain. And this is very different, for example, from what we see in alligators and lizards. things we would commonly call reptiles today, but much more reminiscent of what we see in birds, the descendants of theropod dinosaurs. The semicircular canals, the organs of balance, are pretty well developed. This animal was clearly agile. And we can also see that there are a number of pneumatic systems, air-filled pockets inside the skull. This is a feature present, of course, in birds today, but also in crocodilians, and is probably pretty common in all archosaurs. Now, this quarry yielded not only Cryolophosaurus, but also some remains of a herbivorous dinosaur. Though not as complete as Cryolophosaurus, they include hind limb bones of the knee and the ankle, and they belong to a 1-ton sauropodomorph known as Glacialosaurus. It was probably closely related to Massospondylus, a better-known sauropodomorph from South Africa, but a very large animal, probably one of the largest members of the fauna in Antarctica at this time. And in addition to this sauropodomorph, the 2010-11 expedition yielded remains of 2 others. They were found very close to each other. You can see the one quarry here, and the second one is right under this overhang of sandstone over here. And if we look at what we found over here, under the sandstone, we found a very complete and beautiful set of skeletons lying side by side of a small sauropodomorph. Here you see the skull with the beautiful teeth, the nostril, and the brain case over here. And this is a small animal, so I actually have a 3D print of it. And you can kind of see the dentition over here and the nostril. So this is a quite small animal. And besides the skull, we found parts of the limbs shown here in orange, the girdles shown in red, vertebrae in yellow, and ribs. And so between the 2 specimens that were found side by side, we actually have almost the entire animal. The only parts we are missing are actually the feet from below the ankles. So a fairly complete animal, and you can see not just the skull and bones of this animal, but life reconstructions of it in the exhibit modeled here. And just to give you a sense of scale, these are my kids next to it. So this is a very small dinosaur. This is a couple of years ago, so Anisha would have been 9 at the time, and Jaina would have been 6. But they give you a clue of just how small these dinosaurs were. And so one of the questions we, of course, would ask ourselves is whether they're small due to the fact that they live in a harsh Antarctic climate that might be producing less plant material for them to consume, or are they simply juveniles? And to answer that question, we can look inside the bones. So just as we did with Cryolophosaurus, we cut some of the bones and looked at them under a microscope to see any evidence of growth. And if we look at the limb bones, what we see is some of those growth lines that I showed you for Cryolophosaurus are completely absent in the limb bones. On the other hand, if we look at ribs or some other slower growing bones, we do see some hints of growth lines. So these small dinosaurs were at most 1 or 2 years old when they perished. And the fact that they have no growth lines in their leg bones, the bones that actually support the body, suggests that they were extremely fast growing. In fact, they grew much faster than their relatives on other continents, which in turn tells us that even though Antarctica was fairly far south, even though plant production would have been limited because of the darkness associated with polar winters, these animals had the ability to grow as fast as their relatives on other continents, and we don't actually know how big this small dinosaur would have grown. We are fairly certain it is not a juvenile of Glacialosaurus. It is a distinct taxon, but there's no reason to think it might not have reached similar body sizes. And this isn't the only new species. The other taxon we found very nearby is represented by a little less of the skeleton. We have the hip region, including the femur or thigh bone. And though not as well preserved, there's enough material here to tell us that yet again we are dealing with a distinct or different kind of dinosaur. So we now have 3 species of herbivorous sauropodomorph in this fauna alongside our specimens of Cryolophosaurus. We do find theropod teeth in the formation, and those that we have seem to match Cryolophosaurus. So we have no evidence yet of a greater diversity of carnivores, but we certainly have a very high diversity of herbivores in this one spot in time. And interestingly enough, it seems like these three herbivore species are actually not closely related. So if we look at an evolutionary tree to figure out what animals our Antarctic species are most closely related to, it turns out that each of the three species has closest relatives on a different continent. So the Antarctic species here are shown with red lines, such as Glacialosaurus, or our two new species, which still don't have species names. We're working on that. But in each case, their closest relatives occur on different continents. So rather than having a radiation or a group of specialized Antarctic species evolving on site, what we're actually seeing is these animals are able to disperse and speciate across the globe. So we're still at a time shortly after Pangea, or right as Pangea is starting to break up, but the proximity of the continents means that the world is really still a biogeographic superhighway in which animals are able to disperse quite freely across the globe. And therefore, you will often find that an animal on one continent has its nearest relative on another one on the other side of the world. So a very different type of evolutionary scenario that the one we see today, where the continents are separated by deep oceans. And so, for example, many of the animals we see in a place like Australia are all much more closely related to each other than they are to animals on other continents. So a fundamentally different world in which evolution operated differently than it does today. So with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. I would certainly like to emphasize that if you do get a chance, please visit the Antarctic Dinosaurs exhibit. You will see a lot of the same specimens that I talked about today. You'll get to experience them in person. There are a lot of fun interactives based on the CT scans and histology and various other studies we have done, so that you can familiarize yourself with the science I've introduced you to today. And with that, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and I would also like to plug the various collaborators without whom all this work wouldn't have happened, and of course the funding from the National Science Foundation. So thank you, and I hope to talk to you as part of this event.